Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I am Jen. I am one of your hosts today, and I am joined by my illustrious colleague. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Kaye. I'm one of the Reader Services librarians here at Syosset Public Library, and I'm really honored to be here with our special guest.
Yes, we are very excited about this interview. We have an author of a fantastic new rom-com. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, my name is Sidney Karger, and the name of my book is Best Men, and it came out like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So my debut novel.
Nice. Before we get too much into the book itself, I always like to start with one question, which is, could you tell us a little bit about your journey to this book? What do you do? How did this book come to be? How did we get here?
Yeah, so I kind of always wanted to be a writer. I started as a kid, surrounded by books with my parents reading all the books. And when I was like 12 or 11 or 12, I kind of sat down and tried to write a choose your own adventure book. And it was obviously amazing. No, it was terrible, but I kind of had that encouragement from friends and family, where's your next book? And are you ever going to write a book? So it was sort of like impressed in my DNA at an early age. And then I became a screenwriter. So I studied screenwriting and I was obsessed with movies and studied it in college and filmmaking. And then I got out of school and I wanted to, writing novels or screenplays just seemed like a dream that was completely inaccessible. And I didn't quite know how to get there. So I wanted to take any kind of writing job that seemed like it could earn a living. And I became an advertising copywriter. And then I did that working for agencies for a few years and left to go to Comedy Central, where I became a writer and director. And the whole time I was writing screenplays sort of on the side. And I was able to get a manager and an agent. And I got out of Comedy Central, became a working screenwriter. This is the long version, but I ended up, writing, selling screenplays and optioning and doing rewrites and open writing assignments in the Hollywood world and things like that. And my film manager actually asked if I wanted to write a book. And I had never really expressed it out loud because I was kind of so wrapped up in screenwriting. And I was, the kid in me was like, of course. And I had ideas and writing short stories on the side and things like that. So I sat down and here we are with Best Men.
So I guess you kind of answered some of my questions, but how different is writing a book to writing a screenplay? You seem to have that book writing bug in you the whole time. Was it difficult going from one to the other or back?
Yeah, it wasn't difficult. It was sort of like a fun challenge. I know a lot of writers say writing is torture, and it is, but I feel like the parts where it actually is clicking and coming together is like when you're running and you hit the runner's high. It's like, oh my God, this works. And so that overshadows any kind of, block out the torture. But writing a screenplay is almost, it's very economical and you're using the sort of omniscient narrator unless you have narration from a character. So it's really, when I started writing the novel, it was a totally different muscle. And it was like, I felt liberated because I immediately was like, yes, this is going to be first person from the character's point of view, which I didn't necessarily always do in screenwriting. And I can kind of go off and have a bigger canvas to explore story and character and just go deeper. And even just the idea of describing a setting for a paragraph was it felt liberating and kind of free. And my hands were kind of typing without my brain. I'm like, who's typing this? I was just kind of going and going. So for me, it was a joy. But then, of course, when you get into copy edits and rewriting it a million times, then I immediately wanted to go back to sort of the cleansing sorbet of a screenplay, which is not that cleansing because it's also 110 pages. But
right.
It was fun to kind of then go back to a screenplay. And then I went back, I wrote a second book. And so I like, because it's a different muscle, it's really kind of fun to go back and forth.
Nice. I'm very curious and interested that you mentioned that you had started writing with Comedy Central for a while, because this book is very funny. Like, it has great
Thanks.
banter. The protagonist has a great voice. And I'm wondering, because it's very funny, but there are like some sadder moments and some bittersweet moments and some, moments of distress. And I'm wondering, like, how do you balance the humor and the heavier feelings that come with writing this kind of story?
Yeah, thanks for saying all that. I did my time at Comedy Central, and it was, every day you're writing jokes or comedic premises, or I was writing the promos for the show, so you come up with these giant, high concept, funny shoots, and I was always obsessed with Comedy Central before I worked there, and then while you're working there, you have to watch all the shows, and so it became. I kind of learned that I was like, I love comedy, but I also love drama. And my favorite thing is when you can have a comedic story that has undertones of drama. Like, I was just watching Succession last night, and it's the most high stakes dramatic story, but it's hilarious. Like, I was laughing out loud, I was crying. So when a story can have that balance of like the funny, sad, I love that. And so I was trying to, when I feel like I'm getting too comedic, then I'm like, okay, what's something that's sort of semi-tragic that can happen? Because I love the sort of roller coaster of the laughing out loud, the hopefully crying a little bit, shedding one single tear. And um, for me, that's the balance. And I don't necessarily write to be funny. I just think it's sort of like when someone's acting, that you want them to be real, and it comes out funny. And I think I try to approach writing in the same way. It's sort of like, yes, this character is really experiencing these things, and I'm sort of focusing in on that ironic, sarcastic, dry wit of the character, and hopefully then it becomes funny.
Nice. So have you taken any inspiration for this book from like anything that you've seen in television or stuff that you've written for TV or for film?
Interesting. Not necessarily. It's more personal than anything I've seen or read. I guess in my DNA, I grew up loving romantic comedy movies. Nora Ephron is like a goddess to me, and Nancy Meyers. If I see a Nancy Meyers movie, I'm like, clear my schedule. I have to watch this for the entire day. And when Harry Met Sally, all the greats, I love. So I guess that I kind of wanted to do that, but it wasn't sort of like a conscious of like, okay, I'm going to write that in my own style. It was more of like, that's in me. And then I had this idea for the character, and then sort of the wedding setting. And I'm like, oh, I guess this is a romantic comedy. And then I had never really written so personal of like about what I know and what I've sort of like quote unquote have done research on, just in the dating world and growing up in your 30s and living in the big city of New York. So for me, it was more of like a personal, how can I put my emotions that I've experienced kind of becoming an adult onto this fictional character and the fictional, scenes that they're going through. So for me, it was kind of like, I think the first screenplay I ever wrote, I was like right out of college, was a coming out gay story. And then I had never really written anything sort of gay stories since then. And so when it kind of became a thing, I was like, oh, what is my sort of take on that? I think I can do that. So hopefully that's where kind of the inspiration came from.
I can also really see like your love of rom-coms in the book when you later on have like the shower that's like come dressed up as your favorite 80s rom-com character.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
I was immediately like, love this, best shower idea ever, best shower ever. Because I'm also like, not that I grew up in the 90s, but like we were talking about John Hughes earlier and how like everyone loves John Hughes and he's such a like, everyone gravitates towards him. But even like when Harry Met Sally was always on the television when I was a kid. So like we all grew up with like these influences.
Yeah.
And you see it definitely in this book for sure. So.
Oh, good. Yeah.
is so personal. And I'm wondering if that's true also when it came to writing New York. Because something that, I like to talk about, people always talk about like world building in sci-fi and fantasy, but you're also doing world building when you're writing about New York or about a library or whatever, And so I'm wondering, is this your New York? Is this your favorite diner, the streets and the places that you go all the time?
A little bit, yeah. I like that you're saying, world building can not only exist, it can also exist outside of fantasy worlds. That's great. It it was a little bit my world, a little bit fantasy world. It was pandemic writing for me. I was writing at the peak
Oh,
of
yeah.
lockdown, and I really wanted to go to my favorite Italian restaurant, and I couldn't leave the house. And then, I really, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to go to Fire Island for 2 chapters. Be on the beach and the Hamptons and like being on the train and like, we were so isolated. I'm like, oh, I'm going to write a scene where you're on a crowded train that I would usually not love, but right now I would. So it was kind of like a wish fulfillment, escapism personally. And then I think the more I've sort of learned like the more specific you get in your writing, the more universal it becomes in a way, because even if you've never been to New York or any of these places, you can relate it back to your favorite diner or Italian restaurant and, wherever you live, and you can kind of recognize, oh, I have that favorite place I like to go to too. So it becomes, a name check fun thing for New Yorkers, but also escapism kind of fantasy world for, if you've never been to New York, hopefully.
Yeah, I recognized all the street names. I went to school in New York for 4 years, so I was kind of like, I've been there, I've been
Yeah.
there, I've been there.
And
Yeah,
that's my favorite thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I'm reading
Yes.
something or watching something, I'm like, oh my God, that's the corner. And
Oh
everyone
my
I'm
God,
watching is like,
I
who
do
cares?
that too. I do that all the time, and people think I'm nuts. And I'm like, no, I like dormed literally a block away from there. Like I know where that is.
I
And
love
everyone has to know.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I love being the person who's like, when they're in a movie, I'm like, you could never get from that street to that street in 20 minutes, like that would.
Yeah, that would never happen. Yeah, I do that too.
One more follow-up. Speaking of it being personal, splunch. Is that a practice that you embrace? Have you splunged? Like, is this something from your life?
That's an actual thing that friends of mine were doing, and I kind of caught onto it later, and I never quite, I don't know, I never used it the way they did, and I kind of felt like I was, an interloper on their splunch, and I was like, wait, but what does it mean exactly? Like I had to ask them what it means, and then years later, I was like, I'm using that.
Any little bit that makes your book seem more personable, little words like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I got permission. They said it was okay. So,
Oh, good. That's all that matters.
Yeah.
Did you find the publishing process to be difficult for a book like this? A gay rom-com. I mean, they're getting very popular now, but we mostly saw them in YA, and now they're coming into adult spaces, which is fantastic and wonderful. But did you find it was hard in this, what's the word I'm looking for? Atmosphere, in this time that we're living in? Or was it, just like publishing any other book? Not that you've published another book, but you know what I mean.
yeah, I mean, it's my first, so I don't have too much to compare it to, but for me, it was kind of a total dream because the past 5 years, I have been getting, like as a screenwriter, I was getting books sent to me to adapt into movies, and they were queer rom-coms and adult. And I was like, oh my God, you can do this now? And then I would go to the bookstore and see all these, a few, but now there are a lot, like Red, White, and Royal Blue, and these great rom-coms. And so it's kind of like, okay, there's rumblings happening here. And so when I started writing it, it was really like this warm embrace of the publishing company and my book agent, who's incredible. And they were kind of like, no, go there. Like, I wasn't sure how far I could go into it and how sort of deeply personal, like people wanted to even hear. And I was getting some good encouragement. And then I wrote, because as a screenwriter, I'm always writing movies as on spec, so basically for free until it sells. And so I was like perfectly happy to write this from start to finish. And my book editor or my book agent wanted to send it out sort of half finished as a partial manuscript with, a pretty detailed outline. And so I was like, no, I'm not, I will finish this. Do not do that. You're setting me up for rejection. And surprisingly, it sold and people wanted it and people were listening. And so I'm still in shock by all of that. So I found it kind of to be a dream scenario. And the publishing team that I'm working with is just like a dream team, and they could not be any better. And I have nothing to compare it to, but I'm pretty sure it's amazing.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I mean, I reflect a lot on like being a teenager, and we didn't have anything, nothing
Nothing.
in the early aughts.
Yeah.
And now it's like every other YA book is being published with some kind of queer protagonist. And again, we're now seeing it being reflected into adult books, and especially rom-coms. I think I've read like 3 or 4 this year, that just, including yours, that just
cool.
came out, and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're all very happy about it.
So something that I love in rom-coms is like when you start out with like the opposite of a meet cute, if it's like a meet awkward or a meet ugly or what have you.
Yeah.
And so something that I love, and I would love for you to talk about, is so how do you navigate the tension between what's pulling the characters apart and what's pulling them together? Like if that were a rope, between the two characters, like how do you keep that taut?
Yeah, good question. I do my little sort of murder board of characteristics and character traits of each character. And I'm, whether it's their taste in music or their sort of where they come from, their hometown roots, or just who they are sort of, organically, naturally. Like Max is naturally an introvert, and Chasen walks into a party and he's like, hey, everybody, and everybody, gravitates towards him. So I try to use all those sort of polar opposites. And then historically, gay characters too have become, or like historically, we haven't really seen the sort of all the nuances that gay characters can have. So I really wanted to kind of have sort of stereotypical on Chasen, maybe a little bit, and then Max isn't totally what you expected, but then throughout the story, those tropes kind of subvert and they become a little more, Max, well, I don't want to give it away, but they subvert themselves and the characters become not exactly what you expect. But I love like a meat disaster. I think they're great.
I like that.
And they always get me. I recently watched You've Got Mail, and it's they could not be at more diametrically opposed positions in life and work and stuff. And I'm like, oh, and I'd seen it a million times before, but I'm like, are they going to get together? How is that like going to happen? And like those, so it's fun to throw in those obstacles of like, hopefully it'll have a happy ending, but you want to throw in like, what are the most creative obstacles you can put in their way and see them sort of overcome, and hopefully, these characters do that.
Yes. When you were writing this, were there any like tropes, rom-com or otherwise, that you wanted to avoid including in your book?
Wanted to avoid.
Or any that you felt you needed to have in there?
Not necessarily. I didn't necessarily like, I have a lot of exposition on their backstories, but I didn't want to necessarily do the sort of dual timeline of like, here we are in the present, and then here's, in the past, in the 90s, or where in the aughts when they were growing up kind of thing as kids. So I kind of like threw in, I didn't want to have, I guess that's the one thing I actively avoided. I wanted to sort of like layer in who they were throughout the story. But give me all the tropes. There's nothing to avoid. I don't love or hate. There's nothing I hate in terms of the trope world, I think, that I can think of. Do you have one that you don't?
The only trope I actively cannot stand in romance is the secret baby trope.
Okay.
Where it's usually a straight couple gets together and the one with the uterus gets pregnant, and then later on they get back together like after 18 or 20 years, and the one who had the child is like, surprise.
Yeah.
And for some reason, to me, that seems really not okay.
Or the secret
I
baby.
feel bad for the
Yeah.
secret
It's
baby.
hard for the secret
That's
baby.
problematic a little, yeah.
The only one. Other than that, like, give me all the meet cutes, give me all the enemies to lovers, give me
Yeah.
all the fake dating. Fake dating.
Oh, yeah. Well,
So-
and most rom-coms have that, like, fake, whatever lie they're sort of telling each other and telling themselves. And yeah, the baby one, I think I wouldn't necessarily want to do that.
Yeah. No offense to anybody who
Yeah.
likes the secret
Yeah.
baby. It's just not my thing.
Also, like, yeah, try, like, if somebody does it well, I'll accept that.
Yeah,
Try,
yeah.
give it a shot. Like,
Yeah, let's see, get creative.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really great. And before we wrap things up, I saw that you have a couple of New York events coming up this summer, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk about those.
Oh yeah, June 5th, I'm doing a little talk at the Strand bookstore with Anderson Cooper. You can get tickets now. I think I signed a bunch of copies. You can get signed copies there. And then August 6th, I believe, I'm doing a talk, like a panel in Fire Island, because part of my book takes place in Fire Island, and then two other books. One is actually called On Fire Island, and Kismet is the other one, which is a town in Fire Island. The three of us are doing like a little panel in Kismet, and you can get RSVP for tickets and go to Fire Island in August.
Oh, that sounds great.
That
I might
sounds
do
so
that because
cool.
I haven't been there I used to go to Fire Island every summer with my uncle,
Yeah.
and I miss it. So yeah.
I
There you
haven't
go.
been there. Speaking of Anderson Cooper, you're doing a talk with him. How did it feel getting a blurb from him? I love Anderson Cooper. He's great.
I do too. I mean, I was sort of shocked that he said yes, because he's, a serious figure who has to report on much more important things in the world. So thank you, Anderson Cooper.
Yeah. That's it for me.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Oh, and one more thing for both of us. We saw on Twitter that you were picketing with the Writers Guild. So just respect, solidarity,
Yeah.
and thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm actually going right now to the next rally and picket. Yeah, so
Have fun. Stay hydrated.
Yeah.
wear my running shoes.
Yes.
Well, thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us. Listeners, please check out Best Men. It's available now, so please head over to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go to get your books. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been
Thank you.
Jen
And Kaye
with
Sidney Karger. Thank you guys. So much fun.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Very welcome. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.